They laughed, and Sophia leaned back in her chair. That high, effortless kind of laughter people use when they want to show they're in on some clever joke. And then she said, "Grandma, you look like a clown in a funeral home," not even lowering her voice, though. We were in my kitchen, at my own table, with two of her friends from work, sipping coffee and glancing at each other like they weren't sure if they should laugh too, or pretend to be shocked. But in the end, one of them smiled into her mug, and the other muttered something about my lipstick being vintage, as if that were the worst thing a person could be. And I just sat there with my hands folded over the rim of my teacup, feeling that thin ripple of heat that moves through you when shame and disbelief collide, because I could not remember the last time she had spoken to me without some kind of barb hidden under the sugar of casual conversation. And yet, I had not expected it to happen so plainly, so publicly, in the space where I had cooked her hundreds of meals and watched her do her homework at this very table when she was just a little girl who still had the softness of trust in her eyes. I am 79 years old, though most mornings, when I sit at my small dressing table by the window and take out my powder and blush and the lipstick I have worn since I was 42, I feel as though I have stepped into some small private pocket of time, where my reflection is less about the years behind me and more about the simple dignity of choosing how to meet the day. I live alone now, in the 2-story house my late husband, Edward, and I bought in 1971, a place that has settled around me like an old coat, smelling faintly of the cedar from the hall closet and the lavender I dry in the kitchen every summer. And for the past 3 months, my granddaughter Sophia has been living here too, or, as she puts it when she is on the phone to her friends, she has been crashing with Grandma while she saves for her own apartment, though the arrangement was meant to be a kindness on my part, a way to give her some breathing room after she said her last rental was too small and too expensive and full of noisy neighbors who partied all night. I didn't mind at first, though I have always cherished the quiet and the small routines of my mornings and evenings, because I remembered how it felt to be young and uncertain about the future, and I thought perhaps my company might steady her eye, little, the way my own grandmother steadied me in my 20s, when the world seemed large and indifferent. But from the moment she moved in, it was as though she began taking an inventory of the house, making small changes in a way that pretended to be helpful, but left me feeling as though I were being erased, one picture frame, one knick-knack at a time. The first week, she replaced the floral cushions on the sofa with gray geometric ones she found on sale online, and I said nothing. The second week, she moved my framed wedding photo from the mantel into the hallway, saying it would look more balanced there, and though I moved it back the next morning, she shifted it again by evening with a bright, "Oh, I think it works better this way, don't you?" By the third week, I noticed my small collection of porcelain figurines had disappeared from the sideboard. She said she had wrapped them in tissue and stored them in the attic for safekeeping, which I understood to mean they embarrassed her. And yet, each morning, I continued to rise at 7, make my coffee in the percolator Edward bought me in 1982, and sit by my little mirror to do my makeup before the day began, not because I was expecting company or had anywhere to be, but because it was a ritual that reminded me I was still myself, still the woman who had worked in the library for 30 years, who had raised 2 children, who had organized church fundraisers and baked for every school fair, still someone whose face was not a blank canvas for other people's judgments, but a record of all she had survived. Sophia never commented directly on this habit until that morning, the morning of her brunch, when she announced she was inviting a few colleagues from her marketing job over for a casual weekend get-together, and I offered to make scones or set out the good china, but she laughed and said, "Oh no, Grandma, we'll just keep it low-key. Croissants from the bakery, mimosas, that kind of vibe," which I knew was code for, "I want my friends to see me in my own element, not yours." I had put on a soft gray dress and my favorite lipstick, a deep rose color that suited me better than the pale shades Sophia sometimes tried to push on me. And I had curled my hair slightly because it was a sunny morning and it felt good to take that extra care. By the time her friends arrived, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, and I had set out my teacup and saucer at the corner of the table. They were polite at first, shaking my hand, saying they'd heard a lot about me, though when I asked what Sophia had told them, they both smiled in that vague way people do when they don't want to answer directly. And then, as I was pouring myself another cup of tea, one of them remarked on my lipstick, "That's quite a bold color, Mrs. Lane." And before I could respond, Sophia leaned back in her chair with that glossy, performative confidence and said it, "Grandma, you look like a clown in a funeral home." It was the way she said it, half laughing, half certain she would be applauded for her wit. That settled something cold inside me, because I understood in that moment that this was not a careless slip or an unkind joke made in private. This was a deliberate framing, an invitation for others to see me as she had begun to see me, as an object slightly out of place, to be pitied or amused by, but not to be taken seriously. I set down my cup carefully, the china clinking just slightly against the saucer, and I smiled, though it felt like I was watching myself from a distance, like I was an actress in a play who had forgotten her lines but knew the scene must go on. I did not speak. I did not defend myself. I excused myself to the hallway under the pretense of checking the mail, and I stood there for a long moment, looking at the row of shoes she had left by the door, her glossy sneakers, her pointed flats, her boots that cost more than the rent I had, paid in my first apartment. And I thought about how quickly love can shift into something unrecognizable when respect is removed, how easy it is for the people we have held and fed and sheltered to turn us into a backdrop for their own performance. When I returned to the kitchen, they were talking about work, their voices bright and quick, and no one mentioned the comment again. I sat down quietly, folded my hands, and listened, but inside I was already somewhere else, walking the long, invisible hallway between humiliation and resolve, the place where you begin to understand that if you do not name your own worth, someone else will write you out of the picture entirely. The morning after the brunch was different from all the others, though it didn't announce itself as such with any grand gesture or storm of emotions. Instead, it arrived quietly, slipping in through the cracks of routine and familiarity, like an unwelcome visitor who has already learned the layout of your home. I woke to the soft patter of rain against the window pane and the dull gray light of early autumn filtering through the curtains, and I knew, without knowing exactly how or why, that something had shifted. Sophia was already awake and bustling about, moving through the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of someone who is trying to squeeze out every last moment of youth and freedom before the clock runs out. Her laughter echoed down the stairs as she talked on the phone, making plans that seemed to exclude me more clearly with every syllable. And I sat at the breakfast table in my faded floral dress, tracing the chipped rim of my teacup with a finger, pretending not to hear the conversations that circled around me like distant birdsong. Beautiful, but impossible to catch. That day, she did something she had never done before. She packed a bag. Not the small tote she used for work or the backpack slung over one shoulder for weekend trips, but a full suitcase, the kind you use when you plan to be away for a while. I watched her zip it closed with a kind of mechanical determination, her eyes flicking toward me as if daring me to ask where she was going or why. But I said nothing. It wasn't my place, I reminded myself, and perhaps it never had been. She slid the suitcase by the door and left without a word, a quick kiss to my cheek that barely grazed the skin, and then the front door clicked shut behind her, the sound heavier than I expected. What followed was a silence so complete it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. I wandered through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too empty, and sat in the living room chair Edward had always called my throne, feeling the weight of absence settle on my chest like a stone. Hours passed, each one folding into the next, with no indication of what might come. Then, late that afternoon, the phone rang, sharp, unexpected, and I answered with a quiet voice, not expecting anyone I wanted to hear from. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Catherine, Sophia's boss, speaking carefully, politely, but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. She said she had been looking for Sophia, that she hadn't shown up for an important meeting, and that this was unlike her. There was concern in her voice, but also something else, something wary, almost cautious, as if she wasn't sure how much to reveal or how much to protect herself from the news she might hear. I told her what I knew, that Sophia had left that morning, hadn't said where she was going, and hadn't mentioned any plans to me. And I could hear the sigh on the other end, soft, but laden with the weight of too many disappointments. Catherine asked if I could reach her, and I said I would try, though I knew it was a promise I might not keep. After the call ended, I sat down by the window and watched the rain streak the glass in slow, deliberate lines, wondering how it had come to this, how a girl I had held in my arms, who once traced my wrinkles with tiny fingers and called me the prettiest grandma in the world, had become a stranger who vanished without notice, leaving behind a trail of cold questions. That night, I found myself digging through drawers I hadn't opened in years, searching not for memories or keepsakes, but for something firmer, something that could anchor me when everything else felt as though it were slipping away. In the bottom of an old wooden box, I uncovered Sophia's high school yearbook, a relic of a time before she had learned to cloak herself in sarcasm and bravado, before she had perfected the art of masking insecurity with sharp words and careless laughter. I flipped through pages marked with scribbles and notes, and my eyes settled on one entry written in her teenage handwriting, cruel, candid, and terrifyingly familiar. It spoke of betrayal, of moments when she had been unkind to others to mask her own fear, of jokes that cut deeper than anyone knew, and of a heart that was still searching, still broken beneath the armor she had built. Reading those words was like looking into a mirror I hadn't wanted to face, seeing the child I had loved and the woman she was becoming tangled together in a knot of hurt and defiance. And yet, beneath the sting of that recognition, something else stirred, a quiet, steady flame of resolve that began to burn away the numbness I had felt since her words at brunch. It was as if the past had handed me a key, one I could use to unlock the silence between us and reclaim the space that had been shrinking under the weight of unspoken resentments and missed connections. In the days that followed, Sophia's absence became a presence in itself, filling the house with echoes and shadows, and I realized that the betrayal was not just in the words she had thrown at me or the careless way she had mocked my face, but in the slow unraveling of the ties that once bound us together, ties forged in love, tested in hardship, and now frayed by years of distance and silence. But I was not ready to let go entirely. I began to gather strength from the quiet places within me, those hidden reserves of dignity and grace that had carried me through loss and loneliness before. And I started to plan, not a confrontation, not a cry for help, but a reclamation of self, a way to remind Sophia, and perhaps even myself, that the woman behind the makeup and the years deserved more than mockery. She deserved respect. This was the moment when I stopped shrinking away and began to take up space again, to speak softly but firmly through actions rather than words, to hold on to the hope that beneath the armor Sophia wore, there was still a girl who remembered the gentle touch of a grandmother's hand and the strength that comes from being truly seen. The catalyst was not just her laughter or the cruel joke. It was the fracture that followed, the moment when silence became a choice, when absence demanded a response, and when I finally understood that the path forward would not be easy, but it would be mine to walk. After Sophia left that morning with her suitcase quietly dragging behind her, the house settled into a silence that was not peaceful, but heavy with absence. I moved through the room slowly, noticing how the light fell differently now that the clutter of her belongings was gone, how the spaces she had touched felt suddenly colder, sharper, like a book missing pages. I went about my day with the rhythm I had learned over the years, making my tea, tending to the small garden by the kitchen window, running a gentle hand over the familiar fabrics of the curtains. But inside, I felt a tightening, a slow constriction that I couldn't name at first, but came to understand as a quiet erosion of my place in my own home. In the days that followed, I began to see the subtle ways Sophia's presence had altered the house beyond the physical rearranging of things. It was in the way my morning coffee was made differently, the milk poured without the gentle warmth Edward used to add, the sugar clinked in a metal spoon instead of the small wooden one I preferred. It was in the way the music played from the small speaker in the living room, modern, loud, unfamiliar, drowning out the soft classical stations I had always favored, as if to claim the air itself. I found my favorite armchair pushed back from the fire, replaced by a sleek gray recliner that looked out of place among the faded floral patterns. It was as though, without saying a word, the house was being repainted in the sharp lines and cold tones of someone else's life, someone younger, faster, less rooted in the history this place held. Sophia began to speak to me in a tone that was both dismissive and oddly performative, as if rehearsing lines for an audience that was not present. She called me cute with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a word that felt less like affection and more like a label for someone charmingly quaint, but ultimately irrelevant. When I reached for my lipstick one morning and opened the drawer to find it emptied, I asked her about it, and she said without looking up from her phone, "I put it away. You never use it anymore anyway." It was the kind of small control that stung quietly, an unspoken message that the person I was no longer belonged here, or at least, not in the way I had once believed. She started to change the pictures on the walls, replacing family photos with abstract art prints she ordered online. I noticed my wedding portrait gone from the living room mantelpiece, replaced by a large black and white print of a city skyline I didn't recognize, cold and distant. The small ceramic vase Edward had brought me from a trip to Italy sat on the floor by the sideboard, tipped slightly as if waiting to be noticed, waiting to be put back. I hesitated each time I saw these changes, unsure whether to protest or let them be, caught between the desire to preserve the memories that filled the house and the knowledge that the house was no longer mine alone. More than once, I overheard her conversations with her friends, snippets of laughter and words that dripped with youthful bravado, mocking the old-fashioned grandma who wore makeup and kept an analog clock on the bedside table. There were social media posts, too, photos she took of me without asking, captions that called me reluctant roomie and joked about my vintage vibes, like I was some character in a sitcom rather than a woman who had lived a full and complicated life. The most painful moments were when she shared these posts with her friends in front of me, waiting to see their reactions, and then looking at me with a mixture of amusement and superiority that felt like a wound without healing. I tried to maintain my dignity in the face of these daily diminutions, but it was exhausting, like holding up a fragile vase with shaking hands, knowing that the smallest tremor could shatter it completely. Friends called less often, unsure if I wanted company, and when they did come, the air was often thick with unspoken questions about my living situation, about Sophia's attitude, about the quiet tension that filled the rooms. I stopped inviting anyone over because I couldn't bear the thought of being the subject of their pity or the object of their whispered sympathies. One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where my makeup used to be stored, and I realized I had not worn lipstick in weeks. It was not that I had lost the desire or the habit, but that I had begun to feel as though my appearance was no longer mine to claim, but rather something to be managed and judged by someone else's standards. The ritual that once grounded me, that marked my presence in the world, was slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of invisibility. Yet, beneath the quiet despair, a small part of me began to resist. It was not loud or brash, but it was persistent, the steady pulse of a heart that refused to be erased, that remembered the strength it took to build a life from the ground up. I started to take back small pieces of my space, placing a vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill, brushing on a touch of blush before breakfast, arranging the cushions just so on the sofa. These acts were tiny rebellions, whispers of defiance that said, I am still here, still present, still myself. At night, when the house was dark and the echoes of the day had faded into a dull ache, I would sit by the window and think about the path ahead. The betrayal was no longer just a sharp word or a mocking glance. It was the slow, deliberate erasure of who I had been and who I wanted to remain. But I was not ready to disappear quietly. I began to write again, not letters to anyone, but in a journal I had kept since Edward died, the pages filling with thoughts and memories and the faint flickering hope of reclaiming a life that had been threatened but not yet lost. This was the first escalation, not a sudden explosion, but a quiet tightening, a narrowing of the world that left me feeling small and fragile. Yet beneath the surface, it awakened a resolve to stand taller, to speak softer but clearer, to prepare for the moment when I would no longer be content to watch my story be rewritten by someone else's hand. One afternoon, while tidying the linen closet in a rare moment of quiet, I stumbled upon an old, dusty box I hadn't opened in years. It was tucked away behind folded blankets and faded tablecloths, the kind of forgotten treasure chest that holds pieces of a life once lived but nearly lost to time. I pulled it out with a slow reverence and sat down on the kitchen floor, the wooden boards cool beneath my legs, and lifted the lid to find stacks of photographs, yellowed letters, and beneath them, the one thing I had not expected to see. Again, Sophia's high school yearbook. The cover was worn, and the pages had softened, the edges curled from being handled by impatient teenage hands so many years ago. I opened it carefully, tracing the familiar font of her name and the scrawled messages written by friends and classmates, some kind, some biting, all honest in their own way. My fingers hesitated over the pages until I found the section where students had left their personal reflections, the small confessions and candid admissions that high school demands. And there, in her own handwriting, were the words that pierced through years of polite silence and careful restraint, a glimpse into the girl Sophia had been before she learned to wield cruelty like armor. She wrote about a final exam she had cheated on, a secret she had kept hidden beneath layers of jokes and defiance, confessing with a mixture of guilt and bravado. Another entry detailed a moment when she had mocked a classmate who struggled with a disability, words that were sharp and unfiltered, the kind of cruelty that can make a young heart harden in order to survive. Reading those words was like catching a glimpse of a shadow I had never fully acknowledged, the girl who had become the woman sitting across from me with her sharp tongue and social media posts that belittled me in my own home. But beneath the surface of those confessions, I sensed something else, something fragile and aching, a young soul grappling with the weight of expectations and the desperate need to be seen, even if that meant hiding behind a mask of cruelty. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for her, but for me as well. I realized that the battles we had fought, the walls we had built between us, were not simply the product of bitterness or disrespect, but a tangled web of fear and longing, of misunderstandings and unmet needs that neither of us had learned to voice. That evening, after Sophia had gone out with friends, and the house was bathed in the soft glow of the street lamp outside, I sat by the window and applied my lipstick, the deep rose that I had worn since the day Edward brought it home from Paris. Decades ago, I looked at my reflection, not with the old habit of measuring time by the lines on my face, but with a new kind of clarity. This was not a mask to hide behind, but a banner to hold high, a symbol of the woman I still was, and the life I still claimed. It was the beginning of a shift, subtle but profound, a turning point where I stopped shrinking into the background and began to reclaim my place, not by loud declarations or bitter confrontations, but through quiet acts of self-respect and gentle assertion. I started to arrange the furniture in the living room again, placing my wedding portrait back on the mantelpiece and filling the vase with fresh flowers from the garden. I dusted off my old journals and began writing letters, not to Sophia, not yet, but to myself, reminders of the strength I carried and the worth I refused to relinquish. This shift rippled out into other parts of my life. I resumed attending the weekly book club meetings at the local library, where the familiar faces and comforting routine wrapped around me like a warm shawl. I began volunteering at the community center, helping with the sewing circle, and sharing stories with other women who, like me, carried their own burdens beneath quiet smiles. These small acts were more than distractions. They were the threads weaving me back into the fabric of a life that had felt unraveled. In my bedroom, I placed the yearbook on the nightstand, a reminder not of past wounds, but of the complexity of the journey ahead. It was a testament to the fact that healing was not a straight path, but a winding road filled with shadows and light, with moments of forgiveness and moments of hard truth. I understood that to move forward, I would need to hold space for both, to acknowledge the pain without being consumed by it, to assert my dignity without closing the door to reconciliation. The house, once a place where I had felt diminished and unseen, began to feel more like home again. I found myself humming softly as I prepared meals, my hands steady and sure, the kitchen filled with the scents of rosemary and garlic, of bread baking and coffee brewing. The air carried a quiet promise, one that whispered of resilience and the possibility of renewal even in the later chapters of life. This was the midpoint, not a dramatic turning point marked by fireworks or tears, but a steady awakening, the moment when I began to act not as a victim of circumstances, but as the author of my own story. It was the moment I realized that the power to change my world lay not in the actions of others, but in the quiet courage to choose myself every day, in the simple yet profound act of standing tall, brushing on lipstick and saying, I am here, I am worthy, I am enough. Weeks passed since I had found the courage to reclaim small corners of my life, and with every act of quiet defiance, I felt the fragile threads of my dignity begin to knit themselves back together. The house that once felt like a museum of absence was slowly filling with the warmth of my presence again. Yet, just as I was settling into this newfound rhythm, the past crept back in, not with the gentle touch of a memory, but with the sharp edges of a confrontation I had tried to avoid. It came on a gray morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and the air tastes of rain before it falls, when the doorbell rang with an urgency that made my heart leap. I opened the door to find Sophia standing there, her face a complicated map of hesitation, defiance, and something I could not quite name, perhaps regret or frustration, or maybe just exhaustion from the weight of the roles she had taken on so young. She held a small envelope in her hand, and her eyes darted past me, avoiding the cracks in the porch and the chipped paint that told stories of a life weathered but still standing. Without a word, she stepped inside, her boots clicking on the hardwood floors, and I closed the door behind her, the sound echoing like a final seal on a chapter long left open. We sat in the living room, the space between us heavy with things unspoken and wounds that had not yet found words. She looked at me, her gaze sharp and searching, and finally said, I've been thinking about what you found, the yearbook, about everything I wrote, about who I was and who I am now. I nodded, waiting, the silence stretching thin and taut like a fragile thread. Sophia's voice softened, the sharp edges blunted by something raw and vulnerable. I was a mess back then, Grandma, more than you knew. I was angry and scared, and I didn't know how to ask for help, so I made jokes. I pushed people away, even you. I thought if I could make people laugh, no one would see the cracks. Her confession hung in the air like a tentative olive branch, and I saw before me not the young woman who had mocked my makeup, but a granddaughter grappling with the weight of her own past mistakes. Yet, just as the room seemed to soften, the doorbell rang again, shattering the fragile moment. I stood to answer, and there, framed by the rain-slicked porch, was Catherine, Sophia's boss. The woman who had called me weeks before, her face lined with concern and a weariness that spoke of battles fought behind polished office doors. Catherine's eyes met mine with a mixture of apology and resolve. She said she had come to talk, not to judge, but because the workplace had been unsettled by Sophia's recent absences and behavior. She spoke of policies and performance reviews, of second chances and consequences, but beneath the corporate language, I heard the weight of disappointment and hope tangled together. The room felt smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness a reckoning. Sophia listened, her jaw clenched, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and when Catherine finished, there was a long silence before she said, I'm sorry for how things have been, for how I've treated you, for the things I said and did that hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want to try to be better. I watched as the granddaughter I had known and loved wrestled with the woman she was becoming, and I realized that this second escalation was not just a challenge to my strength, but an invitation to both of us to confront the fractures between us and perhaps to begin healing. Catherine's presence was a reminder that the world beyond our house carried its own pressures and judgments, that Sophia's struggles were part of a larger story of survival and self-discovery. That evening, after they had gone, I found myself sitting by the window, the yearbook resting on my lap once more. I traced the lines of her teenage confessions, the echoes of a girl who had sought refuge in cruelty and laughter, and I understood that our journey was far from over. The battles we faced were not just between generations or words spoken in anger, but within the hearts of women trying to find their place in a world that often demanded silence or submission. In the days that followed, letters arrived, carefully penned notes from Sophia, hesitant and honest, and messages from Catherine, offering support and understanding. These small gestures were like seeds planted in the soil of our fractured relationship, fragile but full of promise. I responded not with grand declarations, but with the steady presence of someone who had learned the power of patience and quiet strength. One afternoon, as I prepared tea in the kitchen, the mail slipped through the slot, a thin envelope addressed in Sophia's careful handwriting. Inside was a note inviting me to visit her workplace, a small cafe where she had taken a new job, trying to build something stable and real away from the shadows of her past. It was an invitation not just to see her world, but to be a part of it again, a step toward reconciliation that I accepted with a heart both cautious and hopeful. At the cafe, I watched Sophia move with a grace I had not seen before, serving customers with a smile that was both genuine and guarded. We spoke quietly during breaks, sharing stories of growth and regret, of mistakes made and lessons learned. There were moments when the weight of the past pressed between us, but there were also moments of lightness, laughter shared over spilled coffee, the clink of mugs, the simple ritual of being present with one another. This second escalation was a turning point not marked by dramatic gestures, but by the slow, steady reclaiming of trust and understanding. It was a reminder that relationships, especially those stretched thin by years of hurt, require not just forgiveness, but the willingness to be vulnerable, to meet each other where we are, and to walk forward together, even if the path is uncertain. In the quiet moments before sleep, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, from the sharp sting of humiliation to the fragile hope of reconciliation. I knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but I also knew that I was no longer walking it alone. The woman who had once mocked my makeup was still learning, still growing, and I was ready to meet her there, with open arms and a steady heart. The day the letter arrived, I knew it would change everything. It wasn't the first time I had taken a stand, but this time the act felt weightier, more deliberate, like stepping onto a narrow bridge that stretched over years of pain and unspoken truths. The envelope was thick and firm in my hands, the paper crisp as if it held the fragile balance between what had been and what could be. Inside was the photocopy of Sophia's high school yearbook, the one I had found tucked away, the pages marked with her teenage confessions, the reckless honesty that had cut through so many of our silences. Alongside it, a handwritten note from me, a message meant not to punish but to reveal, to reclaim, to remind. I remembered the morning clearly. I sat at the kitchen table, the pale light filtering through the lace curtains casting delicate patterns on the worn wood. The teacup in my hand felt heavier than usual, weighted by the years of waiting. The accumulation of hurts too quiet to shout, but too persistent to ignore. I had spent the night rereading the pages, tracing the words she had written years ago, words that spoke of fear and defiance, of cruelty used as shield against loneliness. And I knew that if Sophia could not see that girl inside herself, if she chose to hide behind mockery and dismissal, then I had to find a way to make her confront the past she tried so hard to forget. With trembling fingers, I sealed the envelope and walked to the post box at the end of the street, the crisp autumn air sharp against my cheeks. The letter slipped into the slot with a soft whisper, a small but irrevocable act of courage. I didn't expect an immediate response. In fact, I braced myself for silence, for anger, for the widening of the gulf between us. But life, I have learned, is often less predictable than pain, and sometimes truth has a way of piercing even the thickest walls. Days later, the phone rang, a sharp, insistent sound that made my heart skip. On the other end was Sophia's voice, low and hesitant, the edge of surprise softened by something I could only describe as vulnerability. She said she had received the letter and the yearbook, that she had read every word, every page, and that it had unsettled her more than she could say. There was no anger, no blame, just a quiet admission that perhaps she had been hiding behind a mask for too long. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us, in the small cafe down the street where I had started going again, where the barista knew my order, and the soft hum of conversations felt like a balm to the soul. I agreed, knowing that this meeting would not erase years of pain or misunderstanding, but it could be the first step towards something new. The afternoon was crisp and clear when I arrived, the sunlight dappling through the leaves and casting playful shadows on the pavement. Sophia was already there, seated by the window, her eyes searching mine with a mixture of apology and hope. We talked quietly at first, the words careful and measured, but as the minutes passed, the walls between us began to crumble. She told me about the pressure she felt to appear perfect to her colleagues, the loneliness behind the laughter, the fear that made her lash out at the very people who loved her most. I shared my own struggles, the quiet battles fought in the shadows of love and loss, the ways I had tried to hold on to dignity in the face of dismissal. There was a moment, soft and fragile, when our hands met across the table, a touch that spoke louder than any apology. It was not a sudden reconciliation, nor a fairy tale ending, but a real and tender acknowledgement of shared pain and the desire to move forward. Sophia promised to be more mindful, to speak with kindness rather than cruelty, and I promised to listen without judgment, to hold space for the granddaughter I had always loved beneath the walls she had built. But the true climax was not in the words spoken that day. It was in the act that followed. A week later, Sophia came home and for the first time in months asked if she could do my makeup. She said she wanted to learn, to understand why I took such care with the simple ritual that had become our battlefield and our bridge. We sat together at the dressing table, the light soft and forgiving, and she reached for the lipstick, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the familiar curve of my lips. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but to me, it was everything. In that moment, I saw not the girl who had mocked me, but the woman who was beginning to heal, to see herself not as a collection of flaws and defenses, but as someone worthy of love and respect. The makeup was not just color on skin. It was a symbol of restoration, of reclaiming identity and dignity in a world that often tries to erase the stories of women like us. That night, as I stood before the mirror, the lipstick a bold line of defiance and grace, I realized that the climax of my story was not a grand confrontation or a dramatic declaration, but the quiet reclamation of self through the simple acts of care and courage. It was the moment when I stopped waiting for permission to exist fully and started living on my own terms with love and strength intertwined. The days that followed the meeting with Sophia unfolded with a gentleness I had not expected, a softness in the way the house breathed around me that felt like a quiet promise of new beginnings. She moved out shortly after, finding her own apartment not far away, but the distance between us no longer felt like a chasm, but a space held with respect and hope. The house, once heavy with silence and tension, returned to its familiar rhythm, filled again with the scents of rosemary and tea, the soft ticking of the clock Edward had wound every Sunday morning. I placed my lipstick on the dressing table each morning with renewed purpose, not as an act of defiance, but as a celebration of self, a daily ritual that marked the reclaiming of my dignity and my story. In the weeks that followed, I began volunteering at the local women's shelter, offering gentle grooming sessions to women who, like me, had carried burdens too heavy to bear alone. We shared stories and laughter, the simple act of applying lipstick or brushing hair becoming a ceremony of restoration, a way to reclaim what society so often tries to erase: our beauty, our worth, our voice. The shelter became a new kind of home, a community of resilience and kindness, where I found not pity, but solidarity, and where the lessons of my own journey could bloom into something meaningful beyond my own walls. Occasionally, Sophia would visit, sometimes with a quick cup of coffee, sometimes to linger and share news of her work and the small victories and setbacks that marked her days. Our conversations were no longer charged with the sharp edges of old wounds, but woven with threads of understanding and patience. She apologized for the time she had been cruel, and I forgave her not out of obligation, but because I saw the woman she was becoming, still flawed but striving, still learning what it meant to love without breaking. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the light shift through the garden, I wrote a letter, not for Sophia or anyone else, but for the women who might read this story someday, those who feel diminished by age or circumstance or the careless cruelty of others. I told them that their faces are not canvases for mockery, but maps of survival, and that every line and shadow is a testament to strength. I urged them to wear their stories with pride, to find courage in the quiet moments, and to know that it is never too late to choose themselves. The house, the garden, the small routines of my days became a sanctuary where I was no longer invisible, but fully present. The lipstick on my lips was a reminder that I had not been erased, but had carved out space for myself in a world that often forgets the worth of women like me. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw not just the woman I had been, but the woman I had become, resilient, dignified, and deeply enough alive to know that every chapter is worth telling. So, to the women who find themselves mocked or diminished, who face the slow erasure of their presence or the sharp sting of cruelty from those they love, I say this: your face, your story, your very being is a record of everything you have endured and overcome. Do not let anyone else write your narrative. Choose yourself fiercely and tenderly every day. And when you do, you will find that the world shifts around you, not because it has changed, but because you have. This is my story, not just of betrayal and loss, but of resilience and reclaiming. And if it finds you at the right moment, I hope it gives you the strength to take that first step away from the silence, to wear your face proudly, and to live your truth without apology. Because in the end, that is all we can ask for: to be seen, to be heard, and to be enough. It was in the quiet, after Sophia moved into her new apartment, that the days began to stretch differently, not in the hollow way they had when the house was full of tension, but in a way that gave space for light to pool in corners that had been shadowed for too long. I found myself reclaiming not just rooms and objects, but moments I had let slip away over the years. Slow breakfasts where I actually tasted my tea. Afternoons when I would walk to the small park 3 streets over and sit on the worn bench beneath the elm tree, watching the world pass without urgency. There is a particular kind of healing that comes when you are no longer bracing for the next small cruelty, when you no longer live under the low hum of someone else's disapproval. In the second week after she left, I received an unexpected letter from Catherine. The envelope was cream-colored, her handwriting neat and deliberate, and as I read her words, I felt the echo of something rare in today's world: gratitude with no agenda. She thanked me for sending the yearbook, for the courage it must have taken to make visible a truth that had been buried under years of polite distance. She told me it had opened a necessary conversation at work, not only for Sophia, but for others who carried their own hidden histories of unkindness, mistakes, and growth. Catherine wrote that she believed people could change, that the most stubborn hearts often softened when confronted with a mirror they could not turn away from. She ended the letter with a simple sentence: "You have done something good, not just for her, but for all of us who forget where we came from." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of my writing desk, alongside Edward's old fountain pen and the stack of letters he had sent me during our first years together. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months, not because everything was resolved, it never is entirely, but because I felt the shape of my life becoming my own again. Sophia began calling every Sunday afternoon, a habit that started tentatively, as if she feared the calls might be an intrusion. At first, they were brief, filled with small updates about work, her new neighbors, the cafe she'd discovered at the end of her street. But as the weeks passed, the conversations lengthened, the silences between sentences no longer heavy with unspoken grievances, but comfortable in the way only shared history can make them. She never said directly that she understood why I had sent the yearbook to Catherine, but there was a change in her tone, a gentleness that had not been there before, a willingness to ask questions about my life that she had once dismissed as irrelevant. One afternoon in early winter, she arrived at my door with a box in her hands. "I brought you something," she said, her breath clouding in the cold air. Inside the box was a new mirror, oval-shaped, framed in warm brass, its glass catching the light in a way that softened the edges of my reflection. "For your dressing table," she explained. "The old one's fine, but I thought you might like this." I traced the frame with my fingertips, feeling the smooth metal warm beneath my skin, and understood that this was her way of acknowledging the ritual she had once mocked. I placed it on my table that evening, my lipstick and powder arranged neatly in front of it, and when I sat down to look at myself, I felt the presence of both the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming standing quietly beside me. Life in the house settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. I resumed hosting my book club once a month, the dining table once again spread with teacups and scones, the air filled with the sound of women's voices weaving in and out of story and laughter. I invited neighbors for Sunday supper, not as a show of strength, but because I wanted the warmth of shared meals again. I tended to my garden with a kind of devotion I had almost forgotten, coaxing life from the soil, even in the cooler months, as if to remind myself that beauty can always return, even after seasons of neglect. In early spring, Sophia asked if I would join her for a volunteer event her company was sponsoring, a fundraiser for a literacy program at the local library. Standing beside her in that familiar building, surrounded by shelves that had once been my workplace for 3 decades, I felt something close to pride. Not pride in her polished appearance or the polite way she introduced me to her colleagues, but in the simple fact that we were standing side by side, without bitterness in the air between us. She handed me a flyer to pass out and whispered, "I'm glad you came." That night, after the event, she walked me home. The street was quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden, and as we reached my gate, she hesitated. "Grandma," she said, her voice low, "you've always been more stubborn than anyone I know. I think I needed you to be. I think I still do." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something truer, an admission that she saw me, perhaps for the first time in years, not as a backdrop or a relic, but as a person with weight and meaning in her life. I went to bed that night with the window open, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I thought about how the arc of my life had brought me here, to a place where the lines on my face were not signs of fading, but of having endured. I thought about all the women I had met at the shelter, the ones who had taught me that survival is not just about holding on, but about finding the moments when you can let go. I thought about Sophia and how love, when it is real, survives the storms we put it through, reshaped but still alive. The mirror on my dressing table caught the first light of morning the next day, and in its reflection, I saw myself as I was, a woman no longer waiting for someone else to validate her existence, a woman who had learned that dignity is not given, it is claimed again and again in the small acts that say, without apology, I am here. And in that quiet moment, I realized that my story, with all its sharp edges and tender spaces, had not ended at reconciliation, but was unfolding still, the choices I made to live fully and unapologetically, no matter who was watching.